In this video I'm going to be casting this aluminium wave form which I'm making for my AS level art project, and I'm mainly making this video because I was making something related to aluminium casting and I thought it would sort of be relevant to my channel, and I've not done a video in a while. This is more of a video about greensand casting and metal casting in general rather than specifically how to recreate this object, since this is something which is specific to me and no one else really wants to make something like this, I doubt. I decided to make this video because I've not done one in a while and I was making this and it was kind of related to most of the topics on my channel, and there's a couple more reasons why I haven't made a video in a while, and all of those updates will be at the end of the video. So my art project is kind of abstract and weird, and it's to do with making waves in plywood, and I think some of them look quite cool, and I'm doing them on my CNC machine, which is great because it's much easier than just doing a drawing or something. As well as that, it gives me a really good excuse to do loads of upgrades to my X-Carve CNC machine, and I've already stiffened the X-axis and added a DeWalt 611 spindle, which are two massive upgrades. So expect to see a couple more CNC videos and also an upgrade video on the X-Carve. So my project started off with me just using a program called Ripple Tank to create some waves and then carving them out using V-Carve. I wrote an Instructable on how to do it and entered it into the plywood contest a while ago on Instructables. I didn't win a thing, but the Instructable is still up there if you want to see in more detail how I did this. So these are the resulting carvings, and I think some of them look really nice and they'd be really cool to hang on a wall or something. To develop the idea a little bit further, I then experimented using Blender and then a dynamic paint collision to create a fluid cube surface, and I 3D printed some of these, and then the main thing which I did was CNC one edge of it out of some Baltic birch plywood. So this is the shape that I want to cast, and since it's quite flat, the best method for casting in my opinion would be to use greensand casting. Step 1 is to create a box large enough for you to fit your piece that you want to cast and all of the sand into. I just did this using a chop saw and some scrap pine wood. I used some nails to hold everything together, it doesn't really have to be that strong. Then time for your greensand, and I've made my own greensand a couple of years ago and it really dried out, so I had to add some more water to it. You can also buy greensand, it's basically just very fine sand mixed with some bentonite clay, and it makes mould making for aluminium casting really easy. So I put the plywood piece that I wanted to cast into the box and then sprinkled some flour on over the top. I then sprinkled it over the top by rubbing it between my hands to try and get rid of all of the lumps and bumps in the sand. Any lumps and bumps in the sand will basically translate into lumps and bumps in the aluminium, which are going to be really tough to get out in the end because it takes quite a lot to sand out. After I had a decent layer built up, I started to compact all of it by using a piece of wood, and basically the harder you compact it, the harder the mould is going to be and the more accurate it's going to be. Careful to not compact it too hard, because if it's too hard then it's going to be almost impossible to remove your piece of wood at the end. So this mould is kind of different to the other greensand casting things that I've done in the past, since this is sort of more of a 2D shape. I know it is still 3-dimensional, but it's only got really one flat surface and it only needs to be cast on one side. Most things that you'll cast with greensand will need two different halves of the mould which pull apart. And I do have an old tutorial on how I did that on making a slingshot, and that tutorial will be linked in the description down below if you really want to check it out. So once I flip it over, the piece of wood literally just falls out, it comes out really easily, and thankfully it's created a really nice mould which is almost perfect shape, reflecting the negative of the piece of wood. Time to melt some aluminium, and you can do this loads of different ways. I've got some old tutorials on my channel where I cast aluminium using a homemade charcoal foundry. That's really cheap and not too difficult to do, and it melted down really quickly. Much more recently I built this electric foundry which is much better, much more efficient and so much easier to use. Makes metal casting much more easy once you've got it all set up, but it is quite complicated to make, and it's got PID control so that you can set the temperature exactly, and obviously I'm going to be using that since I recently made it, and the crucible. I set the foundry to go up to about 900 degrees Celsius, since that's roughly where you want it for casting aluminium, since it makes it nice and molten and very hot at that temperature, so it'll flow for a long time before it cools down. If you're just doing this with a charcoal foundry, basically just heat it up as hot as you can get it, and that will easily be hot enough. You can easily get very high temperatures with a charcoal foundry. I worked out the volume of my crucible and the volume of the thing that I'm going to be casting very roughly, and it seems that I just about have enough aluminium if I fill it up completely. However, I didn't take into account the amount of oxide that was at the bottom of my crucible, and there was actually quite a lot, so when I ended up pouring it there wasn't actually enough aluminium. After about 20 minutes everything's molten. I didn't really bother adding any flux or degassing it, since I found it doesn't really seem to make much of a difference for any of my home casts, and I think that's maybe because I'm degassing it wrong, or my borax flux isn't really needed. The aluminium that I'm using isn't actually proper casting aluminium, so it doesn't have enough silicon content I think, so it's quite viscous and there's still a very high surface tension from the aluminium oxide, despite me scraping most of it off the top. Because of this, I have to use another metal rod to try and spread everything out once I'd poured it into the mould. This wouldn't have been a problem if I had a larger crucible and more aluminium, because then it would have all just flowed evenly over despite having a very high surface tension. Because of this, it all cooled down quickly just before I could finish spreading it out, so it didn't cover over the entire mould, but that's fine. I'm sure it won't really matter that much. It's art anyway. Once it came out of the mould, I saved all of the sand, and that can just be rehydrated and reused once I've crushed it down. And the actual cast aluminium piece actually looks pretty nice. It's got quite a nice smooth surface finish, and I think it would have been a little bit nicer if I just poured it in smoothly and I wouldn't have had to spread it out, because that sort of gets a bit of oxide layer in between the sand and the aluminium, and I think that's what's created a little bit of a rough surface. So for sanding, I'm using a combination of sanding sponges and wet and dry paper as usual. The sanding sponges are pretty good for sanding organic curved shapes like this, since they sort of curve around all of the edges, and wet and dry paper is really good for removing a lot of material really quickly and also getting a really smooth surface finish. I ended up using a bit of wet sanding since it's wet and dry paper, and I found that this helped my sandpaper last a little bit longer, so that I didn't go through as much of it. It didn't really seem to have much of an effect on the surface finish, however. The sanding was probably the longest part of this process. Even then it wasn't that bad, since the aluminium is actually really soft because I let it cool down really slowly, and it's a very soft metal. One of the disadvantages of casting something like this is because it's got a lot of divots and indents in it, and they're really hard to get in with sandpaper, so I decided just to leave them in there, and they didn't have a very smooth surface finish on the inside, so it's sort of polished on the peaks and very pitted and bumpy in the troughs. One of the ways that I could have fixed this is by actually then putting it back on the CNC machine and running the same G-code again, maybe at a much slower feed rate and hopefully with some coolant, and maybe I'll try doing that in the future, and that would actually leave a really nice surface finish if I got it right, but it would take a very long time. One of the problems with doing that is the aluminium actually shrinks as it cools, so it wouldn't be the exact same shape, so the X-carve probably wouldn't carve the same thing, and it would probably end up messing it up. I decided to chop off this annoying top bit because it was annoying me and it didn't look very nice, and then once I chopped it off, I then filed down the edge so that it followed this curve, and it gives it a much more organic and flowing shape. Then, after a lot more sanding, it was finally time to get onto the final polish, which I'm going to be doing with a buffing wheel on my bench grinder. I added some soft metal buffing compound to it and basically just started buffing. Whenever you're using a buffing wheel, be pretty careful that you hold onto the piece very tightly, especially with a heavy thing like this, because the buffing wheel can sort of catch it and throw it back at you. That would kind of hurt. There you go, and once I've finished doing all of the buffing, I probably spent about 15-20 minutes on the buffing, since that is the final aesthetic step. It makes it look really nice if you do it properly, and it's definitely not perfect, but this is just an example of what I was using my foundry and Greensand casting for. I thought it would be interesting, so I made a video. And it's definitely much more interesting for my art project if I do something like this, rather than just doing a boring old drawing or something else. I've got a bit of an apology and an explanation for why I've not been doing as much videos lately. I think it's been over a month now since I've done a video, and that's quite a long time. Mostly because I just started doing my A-levels, I'm doing art, maths, physics and chemistry, hopefully going on some sort of engineering degree at university. I'm not quite sure which one yet. Because of that, I've got a lot of schoolwork, but I'm still getting time to make videos. Another reason is I've been working on my electric skateboard quite a lot. I've added a Vesk and added some new wheels, got another battery in parallel, and I got a Wii nunchuck remote to try and make that work, and a lot of things have gone wrong with it, and basically I think my Vesk is malfunctioning very slightly and I need to fix some of that, and that has slowed down that project a lot. Normally I would have had that out in the gap that I've had of a month's video. On top of that, I've been working on much longer projects that have taken a lot more time. For example, the bench vise, that was a very long project that I've been working on for months. Another thing that I've been working on is my wood lathe that I'm still making at the moment. That's a work in progress, but it's going really well. I've managed to attach a motor to it, and I drew up the design over a year ago, it must have been, but it's finally looking like it's going to work, and hopefully in the next couple of months I'll get that full tutorial out. I could on that video have the different steps as I go, like making the base, making the headstop, making the pulleys and everything, but I want each tutorial to have an example of the working lathe in it to show what the lathe is going to look like when it's done. Oh well, thanks for watching. I hope that you've enjoyed this video, even if it is pretty unrelated and to do with my art project for school, but still hopefully you found it interesting because it's aluminium casting and things like that. I'll hopefully see you soon with some more videos, and in the meantime follow me on Instagram and consider supporting me on Patreon for early access to all of these videos.